May 7th, 1977. Torbjorn sat at the dining room table's far end, waving his hands wildly to emphasize his point. He'd recently returned from a trip to the neighboring Chilean research facility, and it had obviously been an exciting journey. "So, Magnar, I quietly stroll up to his door, and we have the samples in hand and knock," Torbjorn continued, knocking on the table. "And that weird Chilean biologist, Paco, tells us to leave, and when we knock again, he swings open his door and leaps on Magnar, making him drop the samples we needed analysed." I shifted my gaze away from him to take a drink of soup. Torbjorn exaggerated his stories all the time, but living on an Antarctic research station meant you had to take whatever amusement you could get, even if it meant a few wild tales. Because it was early May, no one had seen the sun in months. It was challenging to live so far from civilization, but the constant negative degrees outside made it even more difficult. It didn't bother me though. I jumped at the chance to come to this station since I'm an astronomer, you see. The complete isolation, absence of artificial light, and months of continuous darkness made it an astronomer's paradise and gave us a view of the stars incomparable to anywhere else on Earth. Torbjorn continued to tell his tale. Paco was biting and clawing Magnar, but I pushed him off and held him down while he thrashed and screamed. The dude was mental and had so much rage for such a small guy. It was indeed surprising. Magnar was a big mechanic whose duty it was to make sure our generators kept us warm all winter, and I had no doubt he could have easily subdued a psychotic Chilean. But yet, he was overpowered. Torbjorn leaned forward, savouring the attention of the others around the table. I didn't even know what Paco's deal was, but the dude was a straight lunatic. He could have killed him if I didn't intervene and save him. Dr. Holberg, our eldest geologist, sat close to Magnar and perked up. "Are you serious?" he asked. "He'd have to have gone through a lot of stress for him to snap like that." Torbjorn shook his head. "All I know is that afterwards he stormed off into his room and acted like nothing had happened. After a few days, I hope he'll settle down. If he stays like this for the rest of the winter, who knows what'll happen." Yvonne, who sat next to me, nodded. "That would be bad," she admitted. "Are you serious, Torbjorn? You held him down?" I inquired. My uncertainty was audible in my voice. Torbjorn gave me a sidelong glance. "Yes, I held him down. Dude had a deranged look in his eyes. He could have killed someone." I apologized by raising my hands. "I apologize if I offended you." But his expression suddenly changed, and Magnar dismissed us with a contemptuous sweep of his hand. "It's not a big deal. We all snap from time to time, and in this environment, the stress can overcome someone in an instant." Magnar returned his focus to his food, and the table discussion continued. After dinner, we all cleaned up, and I went to my room. I'd been living on the station for many months, and maintaining professionalism was becoming more difficult, seeing as my colleagues had been cooped up in the same space for months. May 8th, 1977. I got up early the next morning and relocated my telescope to a different part of the sky. I'd hoped to find a new planet, and the information from the star cluster appeared intriguing. I went to our communications room. I'd hoped to find a new planet, and the information from the star cluster appeared intriguing. I went to our communications room after setting the telescope system to run for a few hours, and I came to a halt in the corridor, gazing out at the flag that marked the geographic South Pole. North 2 Station was only a few hundred meters away from the pole, which made our station entirely inaccessible by air and most means of ground transit during the winter months. Only scientists like me, as well as a skeleton crew of support workers like Magnar and Dr. Holberg, who made isolated living here feasible, remained behind. When I arrived at the communication station, I noticed Yvonne seated at the display, wearing her headset. She smiled at me and took off the headset. "Hey Ivor, how was it with you and Torbjorn last night?" she said. I just shrugged. "I know I shouldn't get into a fight with him. He's only trying to provide some amusement for us all." She agreed. "I'm sure it'll be okay. Torbjorn isn't the kind of guy to hold grudges, and he gets over it." She shook my hand in hers and squeezed it. I offered her a tiny grin and sat down next to her, absently rubbing her back. It's just, it can become a little weird living with the same people for months, you know. Yvonne cocked her head and studied me over. Tell me about it. The radio blared loudly enough for both of us to hear before I could answer. From where I sat, I could hear the voice of a young man. Do you copy Northview Station? Over. Yvonne grabbed the headset and pressed the microphone. This is Dr. Tristan Fio, resident medic, speaking from the Chilean Research Station, Ordaz. We need immediate help. One of our biologists, Paco, became enraged late yesterday night and began assaulting everyone, and it just isn't him. Numerous others have also gone crazy. Yvonne opened an Antarctica map in search of the Ordaz station, then pressed the microphone button once more. Tristan, how many people are at Ordaz station? We need to know if you have enough resources for an emergency evacuation and potential quarantine. On the radio, there was no answer, and after a lengthy minute, a voice eventually replied. I thought I heard something in the hallway. They knocked on the door. There are just 10 of us living here. Please, quickly. Through the communications, a loud cracking noise could be heard. They know I'm in here. Please. The connection was lost and static filled the room. Yvonne gave me a wide-eyed stare and mumbled under her breath. Let's call a group meeting. We all gathered in the station's living room to talk about what had transpired, and the only thing that everyone agreed on was that we need to go check. Torbjorn gestured with his hand. I'm the only one who knows the journey by heart, therefore I'm going. And besides, I'm probably the strongest here, and who knows what'll happen. I'll accompany you, I responded. My telescope is automatic, and I'm not doing anything here anyway. I need to be present to hold you down if you go crazy. Torbjorn burst out laughing. All right, Ivor, you've got yourself a bargain. This time, I'm not going to make anything up. The remainder of the night was spent getting our 2 snowmobiles ready. We packed additional gasoline and satellite phones in case we got into difficulties, and made plans for the next day's journey. When it was all said and done, I collapsed into bed, tired. That night, I didn't get much sleep, and I thought to myself, how had other individuals gone insane with Paco? Why would they act so irrationally? Was Paco to blame? It didn't make any sense to me. May 9th, 1977. Ordaz Station was about 25 kilometers away, and it would take us a couple of hours to get there on our snowmobiles in the winter weather. We departed early in the morning, but the deep blackness that eternally blanketed the landscape in winter would have you believe otherwise. Nonetheless, our machine's lights were bright, and we made good speed, cutting through the snow between us and Ordaz Station. Even with my specifically tailored snow clothing, the temperature was brutally chilly. It seems when you're riding in temperatures that might kill you in minutes, it doesn't matter what you're wearing. After about an hour of riding, Torbjorn signaled for us to come to a halt. I pushed my machine up against his and turned it off. He dug inside his backpack and drank some water. How far do we have to go? I inquired. He gave me a chilly stare through his goggles. I'm not sure. Who knows if we're even going in the right direction? Silence fell for a little period before I spoke again. I didn't mean to... I began to stutter. Torbjorn said, yeah. He drank all of his water and put it back into his bag. He then turned his machine back on and continued on his way without saying anything more. For a little while, I sat in silence, trying to make sense of what had transpired. Only the drone of the snowmobile motors accompanied us for the next few hours, and I exhaled a sigh of relief when the brilliant lights of Ordaz Station loomed on the horizon. As we drew nearer, I realized the lights I'd seen weren't from bulbs. My relief immediately changed to worry. For fires provided the illumination. The yellow flames licked up the sides of the buildings as Ordaz Station burned. Torbjorn and I walked up to the station after stopping our snowmobiles just outside the compound. Only the furthest buildings from the center remained burning since several structures had already burned out completely. We walked to the station center where we saw what was left of their gasoline tanks. They were a jumble of charred and twisted metal. Next to them, Torbjorn knelt. As if to himself, he muttered, "This tank was blown up intentionally." He didn't even bother to glance at me. However, why would someone blow up their own fuel tank? I inquired. Torbjorn rose up and walked into the main building without saying anything. I kept a careful eye on him as I followed him. That's when we entered the building and immediately saw that the floor was strewn with bodies. Some of them were more burnt than others, but all dead nonetheless. I spotted something protruding out of the chest of one comparatively unburned cadaver in the corridor. I got down on my knees and felt it, only to discover it was an axe handle. "Torbjorn," I said, "I have something here." Torbjorn approached the body and gazed at it. I felt sick and lightheaded almost instantly. Hot bile rose in the back of my throat as I walked away from the body. I closed my eyes and leaned against the wall, forcing myself not to throw up. That's when I noticed a peculiar crunching noise coming from behind me. From behind, I heard Torbjorn speak. "Hey, Ivor, am I lying now?" I swung around, and in his hand, Torbjorn wielded the axe. His eyes, ears and nose were dripping with blood. His eyes were dead set on me, and the rage burned in his eyes. He was filled with a wrath that I had never seen before in my life. Then he sprang at me, axe in hand, yelling, "Am I lying now?" The axe sank into the wall adjacent to where my head had been before I ducked. I lurched backwards, almost losing my balance. Torbjorn was twice my size, twice my strength, had an axe and was wielding it with pure rage. Torbjorn yanked at where it was embedded in the wall, blood streaming down his cheeks like melting water from an icicle. I took advantage of his confusion by turning around and running, hoping to come upon a door leading to the outside. I knew that wasn't going to happen. The station's doors were numerous in numbers, and many were airlocks, which meant I needed time to escape. I heard a splinter of something as the axe broke away from the wall as I darted into a side room. The sound of heavy footsteps reverberated down the corridor and into the room where I was standing. I anxiously looked about and noticed that the flames had eaten away at one of the room's side walls. I gave one final glance down the corridor before lunging at the wall with my shoulder. Under my weight, the fire-damaged wall cracked and fractured, and I fell through, landing hard on the other side. My fall was cushioned by a deep layer of snow, which turned a crash that should have shattered my arm and ribs into one that just knocked the wind out of me. My winter clothing was cumbersome, so I fought to get to my feet. I'd barely gotten a few steps when I heard Torbjorn's heavy footsteps in the snow behind me. Through the winter wind, Torbjorn yelled to me, "Is this true enough for you now, Ivor?" I kept running without looking back until I reached my snowmobile. I got on top of it and started it up. With the axe in his hands, Torbjorn stood a dozen feet away from me, swinging it furiously in the wind. I revved up the engine and drove the snowmobile straight into his standing figure, hitting him directly in the chest. The collision produced a horrible crunching noise, and he whirled around sideways like a ragdoll into the snow. I redirected my vehicle back to the station, and before pressing on the accelerator, I slowed down and looked behind me. In the night, the station blazed brilliantly, and I could see Torbjorn's limp body in the snow. I shook my head, then returned my focus to the snowmobile and began driving back to the station through the onslaught of snow. May 10th, 1977. I gathered everyone in the dining room and told them what we discovered, and then what had occurred with Torbjorn. Dr. Holberg stood forward after I concluded my story. "Well, it appears that the Chilean man Paco has contracted a disease," he explained. "It's not a sickness I've heard of before, but it's the only explanation." He took a few steps back and stared at us. I didn't have to look around the room to know our solemn looks. "This illness appears to be extremely contagious," he added. "I'm no epidemiologist, but I believe we should all be quarantined. Even standing together in this place might be dangerous, and who knows, some of us could already be infected." Everyone smiled and nodded. Dr. Holberg fixed his gaze on me. "Those who had the most interaction with Torbjorn should, in my opinion, be kept behind closed doors and away from everyone else. A shiver ran down my spine. Was it true that I was sick with whatever it was? In just a few hours, Torbjorn had gone from normal to murderous, and I didn't want that to happen to me or the others. Of course, I replied. That makes sense. The group of us who had been with Torbjorn the night he recounted his story had been separated into our quarters. As she came into a room, I grabbed Yvonne's eye and held it for a long time. She closed the door and gave me a sorrowful grin. I followed suit. I heard movement in the corridor as the others placed furniture in front of our doors to keep us out. Dr. Holberg, who was in the room next to mine, spoke through his door. After only a few hours, Torbjorn began to show symptoms, so maybe we don't have to continue this for long. Just try to remember for the time being. If you notice anything unusual, please let me know. The remainder of the day was spent in an agony of boredom. I spent most of my time reading and staring out of the window to the snow beyond. Every half an hour or so, I placed my hand to my nose to see if it was bleeding, but there was none, and I didn't feel sick at all. After a few hours of mind-numbing reading, I slipped into a restless slumber long after the hall lights had been turned out. May 11th, 1977. I was startled awake by the sound of a tremendous bang from within our building. I banged on my door, demanding to be let out, but no one answered. Then I stopped making noise and focused more intently on listening. Sure enough, outside my door, a faint groaning sound could be heard. I kicked at my door in desperation. Each blow pushed it open 1 centimeter or 2 further, knocking down the furniture that had been placed to block the door. Blood was dripping from the eyes and lips of a corpse that lay at my feet. The chest was soaked from what appeared to be stab wounds. I moved away, trying not to vomit at the sight, and several rooms where sick individuals had been residing were open along the corridor. I noticed Yvonne's door and was relieved to find it still shut and blocked by a large desk. I approached it and knocked before speaking. "Are you okay in there, Yvonne?" "Ivor? I'm fine," she yelled from behind the door. I moved the desk out of the doorway and opened it, revealing Yvonne standing before me. "We have to get out of here." Yvonne put a palm to her lips as she spotted the body in the corridor. She blinked and nodded after that. "Where are we going?" she inquired. My thoughts were racing. We have no idea how many people are ill. I propose that we get on a snowmobile and travel to the Australian station. It's a long way, but if we carry enough petrol, we should be able to make it and get help. Yvonne smiled and nodded. We began walking down the corridor, encountering numerous dead bodies along the way, all bleeding from their eyes, and all had numerous wounds inflicted upon them. We arrived at the station's garage, and I peered through the door's window. To my immediate horror, I saw with a crowbar a crazed Dr. Holberg was chopping away at the last surviving snowmobile. His gas tank already ripped away on the ground, and it seemed that he would soon succeed in destroying the rest of the thing. We walked back together when I grabbed Yvonne away from the door. We ducked into the kitchen as the sounds of many pairs of footsteps reverberated down the hall in front of us. I took a glance around and noticed a large walk-in freezer that housed the majority of our goods. I drew Yvonne inside and closed the door behind us. But it seemed it was no use as the freezer door suddenly opened. When the freezer door opened, I turned towards it, bracing myself for a battle with whatever or whoever opened it. Dr. Holberg stood before us, surrounded by a small group, all of whom were covered in blood and clearly insane. Everyone was armed with a weapon. Axes, knives, pool cues, and even a club fashioned from a table leg were among the weapons displayed. They smiled as they looked at us, not moving even a millimeter where they stood. Yvonne screamed from behind me. "Why are you doing this?" Dr. Holberg did not react. Instead, he frowned and wiped the blood from his chin away. Then he grinned, and before he ran forward, I grabbed the freezer door and slammed it shut. From the outside, I could hear their yells and screams, all before they started banging on the door. "No," I said quietly. "No, no, no." I dashed to the door, but it was useless. The freezer was constructed of stainless steel, and the door, which was made of insulation and hard metal, was more than 15 centimeters thick. Yvonne and I exchanged glances. We were both dressed casually in t-shirts and jeans. We were both without our insulating winter gear. Tears welled up in my eyes. Yvonne, I'm sorry. I rummaged through my pockets for anything useful, but all I had was my room's notepad and a pen. In dread, I looked up at Yvonne, her tears soaked into my t-shirt as she went up to me and buried her face in my chest. Seeing as my life is now on a path to the end, I spent my last remaining time writing this journal, and now I'm scared, because I'm starting to lose the feeling in my fingertips. However, I agree with Yvonne. How it's quite ironic we die in a freezer in the middle of Antarctica. Dad, I'm not teaching in that school anymore. Honey, teaching jobs like yours don't open up very often. You know that. So if you leave, you'll be teaching again in the inner city. At this point, I'll go teach in North Korea if it meant that I don't have to go back to that school. So what if they're a little weird, and you thought you would be teaching some well-behaved suburban kids? But you know that they're still better than the inner city kids. Dad, one of the boys brought live worms and ate them for lunch. Honey, you know that was a gag. He was trying to make the other kids laugh. No, Dad, none of the other kids were even paying attention to him. He's just weird, like the rest of the kids. Some of them probably can't afford to bring in a typical lunch, my father responds. Then they would qualify for our free lunch program. Stop making excuses for them, Dad. There is something really strange about them all. I don't want to teach them, and I don't want to be in the same building with them. They're just products of their environment. I realised that we both thought the kids would be transplants from Louisville. However, they're still only 5th grade kids. Dad, they're all weird. I think that there's some odd branch of the Mennonite church or something. Most days, they speak with what I think is German, and they all just ignore me the whole day. I can't even call their parents because none of them have phones for reasons that I don't understand. Honey, no matter what school you go to, it's not going to be perfect, and at least your current students aren't violent. Dad, I don't know why these kids aren't in a private religious school, or why they're not being homeschooled. The principal does nothing but brush off my concerns because he knows he could easily find someone to replace me. I think the principal is being paid off by the parents or something, because there's very little learning that's going on in the school. Why do you think the principal is being paid off? Because I tell him that the kids look at me like I have 3 heads, and that the kids do nothing but chat amongst each other in what sounds like some German dialect, and he just shrugs me off. For example, I asked the kids, what state do we live in? And none of them was able to tell me that we live in Kentucky. They all just look at me like I'm asking what does E equals MC squared stand for. Maybe they're all a little slow, or we never taught basic geography. Dad, they're in 5th grade. What the hell do they learn in 1st through 4th grades? I don't know what else to tell you, other than the grass is always greener. Okay, whatever, I angrily responded. I'll listen to my father and go back to school tomorrow. I know something really odd is going on. How did these kids pass the 4th grade, I think to myself. I try to consult with the other teachers, and they just completely ignore me. I'll be walking the hallways and peek into other classrooms, and the kids are totally oblivious to what the teacher is saying. The other teachers don't seem to care and will talk for hours to basically themselves. I wake up, miserable like every other day, and prepare myself in the most bare minimal way. I swallow as much coffee as I can and then head out the door. I blast jazz music that comes in on the radio because I'm just in that kind of mood. I get to school looking disheveled and ticked off. I'm at my wit's end, so I decide that today I'm getting answers, one way or another. The kids all sit at their desks and I get up in front of them. I purposefully record the class on my phone, which is knownly against the school's policy, but I really want to show my father what I'm dealing with. Okay, class, today I'm going to figure out what is going on. Here is a simple question. What season are we in right now? I wait a few moments to see who will raise their hands first. After a minute, nobody has raised their hands, so I say, come on guys, you're in the 5th grade. This is such a simple question. Still, nobody raises their hands or blurts out the answer. so I decided to call on somebody. Ezekiel, you know what season this is, right? He looks at me with his brown, sullen eyes, like I'm asking him to spell Uzbekistan or something. I continue to stare at Ezekiel until he gives me an answer. Ezekiel, what season are we in right now? I ask again. Ezekiel leans over to the girl next to him and says something in what I think is German. Ezekiel, please answer me and stop talking to Eliza. It's grey. Outside is grey, Ezekiel responds. I stand there, baffled, not knowing what grey means. Ezekiel, did anyone ever teach you the 4 seasons? I stand there and look at Ezekiel. I can tell that his nervousness is turning into anger. Ezekiel, please answer my question. Do you know the 4 seasons? He starts to stew with rage and blurts out what sounds like, "De Vogelkönig wird dich bestrafen." The moment he says that, Eliza gets up and runs out of the classroom, where I assume she's either going to the principal's office or to the bathroom. I stop the recording on my phone out of frustration and go sit at my desk. I blurt out, "Summer, fall, winter, spring. Those are the 4 seasons," in the most unenthusiastically tone possible. I sit with my head on the desk for a moment. "Miss Klein, please come to my office." I get up from my desk with a feeling that I'm going to be reprimanded for asking a kid, what season are we in right now? I shuffle my feet towards the principal's office, wishing that I had some whiskey or a noose or something. "Miss Klein, Eliza came to my office saying that you were harassing Ezekiel. What do you have to say about that?" "Bob, if asking a kid to name the 4 seasons is harassment, then yes, I was harassing him." "Miss Klein, our school has a 0 bullying policy, so I'm going to have to give you a verbal warning." My mind goes numb after hearing that, and I leave his office when he stopped talking. I go back to my classroom and sit at my desk and say, "So much for learning algebra," under my breath. For the rest of the day, I sit at my desk and look at a National Geographic magazine that I had brought at the start of the school year. I get so tense thinking about the principal reprimanding me by saying, "I'm giving you a verbal warning," which is clearly unjustified. As the kids talk to each other in whatever foreign language, I come up with a plan to follow them when they walk towards their homes together after school, which is weird enough on its own, that they all walk together. I sit at my desk until the final bell rings. Once the bell rings, I let all 24 of the students leave the classroom and I wait a minute to give enough separation between them and me. I head out of my classroom and follow behind them on the sidewalk, where I maintain a distance so they can't see me. It looked like it was going to rain all day on this cool autumn afternoon. We walked close to a mile, and I see that the kids have made their way towards a big red barn that I'm surprised hasn't been torn down to make space for high-density development homes. I see all 24 of the kids go inside the red barn and close the door. I see that there is a hole in the side of the barn that is most likely caused by a woodpecker. I look inside the hole and see something that is really strange. Where 23 of the kids have formed a circle and one of the kids is flapping around like a bird. There's no joy or humour coming from the kids' facial expressions as they look like they're performing some type of ceremonial worship dance or something. I look through the hole in a trance-like state because I'm in total shock of what I'm seeing. All the kids start wiggling both their hands in unison towards the sky as I'm looking through the hole, shaking my head in confusion. Then I see Martha stop wriggling her arms as she looks at me through the hole in the barn. For a second, I hope that she's not looking at me, but then she says something to the rest of the kids, where they all stop doing their ceremonial movements and they all start to look at me through the hole that can't be bigger than 4 inches. I quickly move away from the hole and say, "Oh damn," out loud to myself. I then hurry away from the barn with the hopes that the kids couldn't make out that it was me. I walk as fast as I could back to the school to get my car. Once I get to my car, I drive towards my dad's place. I feel like one of those mothers who has 10 kids but isn't able to manage 1 kid, where my hair is all disheveled and I'm completely stressed out. I drive as quickly as possible to my dad's place and make a quick dash for his front door. I go through his front door and say, "Dad, I want to show you this video I made." I continue to walk through his house yelling, "Dad? Dad!" But he's not responding, which is definitely out of the ordinary, because his car is out front. I text him a couple of times with no response, so I call him, and still I get no response. This is strange for him to not be here with his car in the driveway, and him not answering my texts or phone calls, I keep thinking to myself. I decide to replay the video on my phone that I recorded of Ezekiel and the rest of the kids, hoping that my dad will return. I get to the point where he angrily says something in that language, which I continually pause and rewind until I get to what I think the spelling should be for what he said. I then put those words into Google, where I see references that some of the words are German, so I put the German phrase on an online translator, which displays, "The Bird King will punish you." Why can a 5th grader say something like that? I say out loud to myself. 4 hours have passed and I start to panic that I haven't heard from my father, who is on disability for a degenerative hip problem, so I know he should be here. I call the local police and explain the situation about my father, and they allow me to file a missing persons report related to his disability. I wait around the rest of the night and he doesn't show up, so I'm certain that something bad has happened to him. I wake up the next morning and my dad still hasn't returned. I call the police if they have heard anything, and they say that they haven't heard anything about my dad's disappearance. I call Bob, the principal, and explain my situation with my dad, and he responds, "This is unacceptable. You need to be here." I shake my head in disbelief, and I apologize to him and tell him that I'll be back tomorrow. I spend the rest of the day looking for my dad in the car. I knock on strangers' doors and go to the local stores to see if anyone has spotted him. I get no leads, so I go back to my dad's house and stay the night with the hopes that he would return. He doesn't return, and I even find his cell phone in the center console of his car, which is deeply disturbing because there's no logic for him to leave and for him not to take his phone. I go to bed again, completely stressed out, where I get about a total of an hour and a half of sleep. I drag myself out of my dad's house the next morning and hurry to my apartment to get dressed so I can go to school, which I'm really dreading, but I know that my dad would want me to go. I drag myself to my classroom and I don't even acknowledge the kids when I sit at my desk. I take a quick look at all 24 of them, and they creep me out even more now that I'm sleep deprived, because I haven't slept for more than 3 hours in the past 2 days. I look away from the kids and I see what looks like a children's book on my desk that was made for a toddler. The book has an oversized baby yellow chicken on the cover, and something seems off about the book just by looking at it. I open it up to the first page and it says, "We are all his children," where the oversized yellow chick has these strange red eyes and is flopping around. I turn the page and it says, "So we obey his rules." I blank out the picture of the chicken and focus on just the words as I turn the pages. "So everyone stays safe." Next page, "We mind our own business." Next page, "And when we don't, things go missing." I pause for a second, and with my sleep-deprived face, I look up at the kids and see that they're all staring at me intently to see what I'll do next. The last bit of adrenaline goes rushing through my body when I read back. "And when we don't, things go missing." I turn the page. "Don't despair if this shall happen." Next page, "Just flap around like our dear Lord Chicken." I sit and stare intently at the book, as I'm certain that this is meant for me. Feeling completely spent and out of options to find my dad, I get in front of the class and flap around like a bird or a chicken. All 24 of the kids stand up from their desks and wriggle their arms in unison to the ceiling, which is to replicate the movements of worms. I do this until I'm completely exhausted, where I fall to the floor. Laying on the floor in a fetal position, I think to myself that this must be worse than death. After a few minutes, my phone starts to ring, which I realize is either Principal Bob firing me or the police telling me that my father is dead. I slowly get off the floor like the dramatic, slow-motion scene from Rocky, where the fate of the match depends on me getting up in time. The phone is still ringing as I get up, and I wobble myself to the desk and answer the phone. "Honey, I saw you try to call me." "Oh my God, Dad, is that you?" "Yeah, what's the matter?" "Dad, you've been gone for the past 2 days. Where are you now?" "I'm in the driveway, in my car." "Dad, I was in your car. How did you get there?" "I've no idea. I thought I just took a short nap or something." "Okay, I'll stop by later when school is over." I feel a sense of elation that my dad has mysteriously returned. I decide to follow the rest of the teachers, so I get in front of the class and pretend that I'm teaching with the intent of never asking any of them a question again. Whatnots, knickknacks, tchotchke, trifles, bric-a-brac. You know, keepsakes. My Aunt Mandel had hundreds of them, in the cobwebby darkness above the bathroom door, starting down from the headboard of the bed with those unblinking eyes and wide painted smiles, marching along the hallway shelves looking like pale dusty dancers twisting in the moonlight. At 10 years old, they fascinated me. Why would anyone bother having toys that they never played with, that just sat around gathering dust? What was the point of all these little ceramic people? I remember the day that my curiosity turned to fear. I was alone in Aunt Mandel's upstairs hallway. The laughter and light conversation of the adults drifted up from the staircase, my eyes fixed on a set of mugs in front of me. Each mug was shaped like a face, a grinning English gentleman, a drunk sailor, a winking lady. Aunt Mandel was very strict about her privacy and her possessions. She'd probably be furious if she knew I was exploring the house by myself, and I might not ever have another chance to get a closer look at these weird old things with their soulless eyes and fixed expressions. I reached out my hand for the sailor. As I did, the pupils of the painted eyes shifted. They were looking right at me. To my shock and horror, the mug's face began to change. The rosy cheeks stretched, becoming gaunt and starved. The bright eyes shrank and retreated into bruised, hollow sockets. The jaw dropped from the smiling mouth, which opened into a toothless pit. It was like it was screaming. I screamed at myself, then fell backwards in my hurry to escape. I scrambled to my feet and ran straight into Aunt Mandel. "What are you doing up here?" she asked coldly. Talking to Aunt Mandel was always like an interrogation. I grunted with fright, pointing up to a perfectly ordinary porcelain mug. I blinked. There's no way I just imagined all that, right? "Be good for your Aunt Mandel, honey," I heard my grandfather shout up the stairs. Of course, my parents' yearly anniversary getaway, the one where I always got left with some relative for a few days. This was the first time I was staying over with Aunt Mandel. They must have had no other options, I thought. The thought that I'd be sleeping with all these eerie figurines around made my stomach churn. Like most 10-year-olds, I hated being compared to other kids, but I had a sudden urge to grab my mother's skirt and beg not to be left alone with my creepy old aunt in a creepy old home. I was still trying to think of a way to convince my parents when I heard their car start outside. Panicking, I ran past the rows of staring trinkets and out into the driveway, but it was already too late. They were gone. Behind me, I saw the dark shape of Aunt Mandel on the porch, her hands crossed behind her back, waiting. Aunt Mandel had always been a mystery to me. She was my mother's older sister, yet she looked younger than any of her siblings. Even so, with her glacial blue eyes, pale blonde bun of hair, and square jaw, intense or calculating would describe her better than youthful. When she spoke, people in my family did as they were told. Even my father, who had his own business and didn't take crap from anyone. On the rare occasions Aunt Mandel showed up for the holidays, she sat at the head of the table, slept in the best bedroom, and scheduled our activities with the cold precision of a train timetable. When she showed up, conversations got quieter. like even the adults were afraid to speak out of turn, but no one ever talked about it. Thanks to Aunt Mendel, I first experienced the unsettling realization there were people out there who my parents were afraid of, and some of them were in my own family. Slouching my shoulders, I followed Aunt Mendel back into the house. She opened the door seemingly at random and pointed inside. "This will be your room." Before me, I saw a cot that looked about as soft as a rock, a giant antique metal fan, and wall-to-wall knickknacks. Aunt Mendel looked me over sternly, ignoring my crestfallen expression. "Dinner is at 7 sharp. Do not touch anything except what you brought with you." Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched back down the hallway. I sighed, lay down on a slab-like cot, then took out a chapter book and started to read. As hard as I tried to distract myself with the adventures of the Magic Treehouse kids, I just couldn't relax. Aunt Mendel's house had the stillness and silence of a predator readying its leap. Every time I looked up at the embroidery, statuettes, and other keepsakes, I felt sure they'd shifted somehow, and the more I noticed, the more intense the changes became. The strings from a piece of needlework rewove themselves into a string of numbers. 138576, 138577, 029078, 155626, 155628, 155629. There were hundreds of them. I finally tore my eyes away to focus on a series of paintings, the sort of phony 19th century kind that usually showed a hunter stomping around with his hounds, a peaceful fall scene. There was nothing peaceful about the image before me. The background had become black smoke, a burning pit and searchlights lit the scene. The hunter's clothing was black too, except for a red armband with a symbol on it that I was sure I'd seen on TV before. His hounds had become German shepherds, and instead of a fox, he pointed his rifle at a wall of emaciated people in pajamas. 10-year-old me had no idea what to make of this, but the gruesome details were becoming more and more realistic with each passing moment. If I leaned in close, I could even smell the ashes and hear a shrieking siren. Shuddering, I fled. Outside, I found an old soccer ball that some neighborhood kids must have lost in Aunt Mendel's overgrown garden. I kicked it around a bit, mostly just to try to forget what I'd seen. I wondered where Aunt Mendel was. I wondered how she could live in that house. She didn't seem to care about or even notice any of the strange goings-on. It made me think that maybe even ghosts were afraid of Aunt Mendel. I managed to kill time until the sunset, and a distant clock told 7 p.m. Aunt Mendel was already placing a lone plate on the kitchen table. "Your dinner," she stated. "Clean up when you're finished." Maybe Aunt Mendel just wasn't hungry, I figured. Truth was, I wasn't exactly excited about boiled cabbage and potatoes either, but that was my only option. Aunt Mendel watched me eat for a moment, a knowing smirk on her face. She seemed to enjoy my struggle with the boiled vegetables. Then she was gone again. Alone again, I forced down as much of my food as I could, cleaned up, and took out my drawing supplies, doing my best not even to look at anything except the paper in front of me. There was no sound except the ticking of clocks. "Bedtime," Aunt Mendel said from behind me. I flinched. Where had she come from? It was only 9 p.m. But I was so bored and on edge that I followed without any complaints. "This will be your last chance to use the bathroom until morning," Aunt Mendel informed me. A keyring glittered in her hand. She was going to lock me in. "Your parents will be so disappointed if you got yourself hurt during the night," Aunt Mendel mused by way of explanation. Then she shut the door and twisted the key. I lay on the hard cot with my eyes open. Aunt Mendel's words had sounded like a threat. One way or another, I was locked in here with those things. Something clattered behind me. I spun. A group of figurines had fallen to the floor beside the bed. In the moonlight, they looked like a pile of gaunt, starved corpses. I imagined them starting to move, rushing me, swarming up the blankets. Something was moving in the painting on the wall. the hunter and his dogs had completely disappeared. In their place was a nighttime forest clearing lit by firelight, hung with banners bearing the same weird symbol from earlier. A boy my age lay on an ancient slab of stone with 5 hooded figures surrounding him. The pale light glittered on their armbands and the daggers. When I looked back to the figurines, they were at the edge of the bed, in a row like marching soldiers. Pointed porcelain teeth glimmered inside their tiny mouths, and each face wore a vicious, bloodthirsty expression. That was it then. Those things moved when I wasn't looking. I just had to keep my eyes on them, I thought. I sat up in the cot with my heart pounding, trying not to even blink. If I fell asleep... I was still in a sitting position when I awoke with my head on my chest, drooling. Morning sunlight streamed through the window. My sleep had been restless, and I felt more drained than rested. As I ate the rye bread and water Aunt Mandel provided for breakfast, I noticed 2 tiny puncture marks on my right wrist. I spent the day outside again, as far as I could get from the animated keepsakes and grotesque art. Apart from butterflies, beetles, passing cars, and Aunt Mandel's shadow in the window watching me, I didn't see anyone all day. Boiled potatoes and cabbage were back on the table at 7 sharp, and while I ate and tried to ignore the words on the live, laugh, love sign shaping themselves into words I didn't understand. As before, Aunt Mandel locked me in my room. This time, though, I didn't dare look around. Like a scared animal, I burrowed deep into my smelly wooden blankets, only leaving a tiny hole near my head to breathe and peer out of. If I pretended to sleep, I hoped sleep would come. Sleep, and nothing else. I was just dozing off when I heard, or thought I heard, a key turning in the door lock. Someone or something was trying very hard to slip silently into my room. Through my hole in the blankets, I glimpsed a dark shape crawling toward me on the rug. I shut my eyes tight and pretended to sleep. Seconds later, I felt the stickiness of saliva on my forearm and a sharp puncture. It was like my life was leaching out through my arm. Although I tried to keep quiet and still, the shock of it made me yelp. The figure paused, then retreated, crawling backwards out the door on all fours with freakish speed. I didn't dare move or open my eyes. But when I did, I saw Aunt Mandel's keyring on the floor, shining in the moonlight. Dizzy from blood loss, I staggered from the cot and grabbed the keys. I looked at it curiously for only a moment before slipping them into my pajama shirt and collapsing into a deep but troubled sleep. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of Aunt Mandel storming around the house, opening drawers and slamming cabinets. "Where are my keys?" she demanded. "If you've taken them..." I shook my head vigorously. It was true, after all. I hadn't taken them. It was more like they'd been left in my room. The metal was so cold it seemed to burn against the skin of my chest. "I'm going to retrace my steps," Aunt Mandel warned, emphasizing each word slowly. "If you've stolen from me, I'm going to find out about it, and the consequences will be terrible." I shuddered, but I kept my mouth shut. Aunt Mandel turned on a heel and slammed the door. When I heard a car start, where else had she been last night, I knew that I was about to be left alone in the house of locked doors. But I had the keys. Soon, the silence was complete. I peered around the bedroom door. Nothing moved in the dusty light. I kept my eyes away from Aunt Mandel's knickknacks, not wanting to even imagine what they might be twisting themselves into now that she was gone. Instead, I unlocked one door after another, not even sure what I was searching for. There was an office-style room with a desk for paperwork, antique furniture, and a display of at least 50 antique postcards on the wall. I watched the pool of blood begin to spread across the lovely images of old-world European cities. The black shadows of planes moved across the spreading bloodstains. A crescendo of roaring engines rose from the endless squadron, so loud I thought for sure Aunt Mandel would somehow hear it. I quickly shut the door. I passed through rooms of covered furniture and old sports equipment, canning supplies, luggage, always with some grim scene playing out in the background. Soon, I closed the door to the final room, Aunt Mandel's bedroom, with nothing to show for my efforts. I sighed. How on earth was I supposed to make the keys reappear without getting caught? As I pondered, I heard a loud clack. All of the knickknacks in the hallways had turned or tilted to one side, from figures in the paintings to glass statuettes of dogs. They were all pointing to the doorless, dead end of the hallway. But there was nothing to see down there. Or was there? As I examined the wood panelling, I noticed a shallow, round indentation where no key would ever fit, but a keyring might. As expected, Aunt Mandel's keyring was a near-perfect match once I placed it right. A square door, just large enough for an adult to squeeze through, popped out from the wall in front of me with a click. It had been so smartly hidden by the carpentry that I'd walked by it countless times without noticing anything unusual about the wall. A cool, musty breeze hissed through the gaps around it. I twisted the keyring and pulled it open. On the other side, a stone staircase led down into the cellar that I'd never known existed. Like the door, it was a space designed for crawling, not walking. I snatched a dim flashlight from one of the spare rooms. Guided by its flickering, grimy beam, I moved on all fours into the cobwebby darkness. The tunnel was old, but not unused. There was no dust on the stone steps I crawled down on my hands and knees. Even so, it was so dark I nearly fell from the drop-off at the end of the stairs. It was only about 3 feet high, but that's a lot when you're 10 years old. I lowered myself down the slippery rock into the pentagonal chamber, wondering what on earth I'd gotten myself into. On each wall hung one of those red banners with a white circle and the funny X in the middle. In the center of the cellar floor was a big flat rock like one from the painting, with weird symbols carved all around the edges. In a locked safe that I now had the key to, I found black and white pictures of a much younger Aunt Mandel with a bunch of other people in uniforms, some yellow documents in that funny language the embroidery had turned itself into, and a dagger like the one from the painting. I had no idea what it all meant, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be looking at any of this stuff, especially when I dug deeper into the weird old reports and found the pictures of the skeleton-thin people and the stuff that was being done to them. I was horrified and disgusted, but I thought about something one of my teachers had said. If you see something bad or dangerous, you need to tell an adult about it. But who would believe me without proof? After hesitating, I scooped up one of the folders with the sickening photos and paperwork, then clambered out of that awful basement. I was panting by the time I crawled out of the hallway. I looked around at the knickknacks, art pieces, embroidery, and other junk lining Aunt Mandel's walls. I was starting to have a different idea about what was happening in this weird old house. Maybe whatever was messing with Aunt Mandel's trifles weren't trying to scare me or hurt me. Maybe it was trying to warn me. No sooner had the thought passed through my head when a shelf gave out beside me, causing figurines to shatter on the floor in front of me. The broken pieces formed a word. Run. If it hadn't been for that sudden shock, I wouldn't have looked up to see Aunt Mandel climbing, spider-like, along the ceiling, her head twisted around to glare at me. She hissed something in that strange language. I didn't need any further motivation to follow the shattered ceramic advice. As I barreled toward the light of the front door, I could hear shelves, display cases and clocks collapsing in Aunt Mandel's path, buying me time. I burst out into the bright sunlight, Aunt Mandel's papers still clutched tight in my hand. I looked desperately to my left and right. The streets on this stately, old-world style of town were all too quiet. I felt hot tears running down my cheeks. There was no one to help me. An engine rumbled. An antique car out for a Sunday drive was pulling up to the next intersection over. I charged toward it, waving my arms, papers flying everywhere. It was a miracle that the middle-aged driver was going slow enough to avoid hitting me. He stopped, and although I was too out of breath to explain, the pictures and my face said it all. As I climbed into the passenger seat, I twisted around to look behind me and saw Aunt Mandel's shadow slinking back into the house. Everything that happened after that was a blur. My parents came back from their vacation. The police walked right in the swinging front door of Aunt Mandel's empty house. They found the room that I described. It was through their investigation that I learned for the first time about the Holocaust, the Nazis, and their obsession with the occult. The investigators attributed my story to trauma and an overactive imagination, but they were at a loss to clarify anything about what happened. The best guess was that the person I'd called Aunt had been a mentally deranged child of Elfriede Mandel, who immigrated illegally to the United States, despite her crimes, as part of Operation Paperclip. After all, how could Elfriede, born in 1913, still be alive to creep around on ceilings and feast on children's blood? In any case, there was no evidence of any crime. The woman I called Aunt Mandel had just vanished. Back at home, my mother explained to me in hushed tones about the aunt who'd helped her grandparents escape from the ruins of Germany, who had ruled the family with an iron fist for as long as anyone could remember, who barely aged, just becoming more sadistic and demanding with each passing year. Now that a secret was out, she disappeared. But to where? There's been no trace of my strange aunt since I fled from her house at 10 years old, 20 years ago today. And yet, I have a horrible feeling that one day, I'll turn a corner and see that familiar, stern, wide-jawed face and blonde bun barely aged a day, but looking very hungry. "Go feed the chickens," Ma said, "and bring in some eggs while you're at it." I did as I was told. It was a cold October morning. I went outside to feed the chicks, as I do most mornings. It's my job, and I don't mind doing it. I love the chicks, especially Birdman, the big, grumpy rooster who serves not only as my pet, but also as my alarm clock. He didn't wake me up this particular morning, which was odd. Me and Ma live in the middle of nowhere, so when something out of the ordinary happens, it usually means trouble. Then, I saw the blood. The chicken coop, which my father built 2 summers ago, just before Ma kicked him out, seemed unprovoked. That said, a pool of thick, crimson-coloured blood lay at the foot of the entrance. Also at the entrance was my beloved Birdman, decapitated. I cried briefly, then I ran inside and told Ma, who became angry with me, like it was my fault or something. "You must have left it open last night," she snapped. "How many times do I have to tell you to lock that damn door at night?" I scratched my head. I knew I hadn't left it unlocked. No way. I may be 13, but I ain't stupid. "Nuh-uh," I said in a pouty voice, shaking my head. I still couldn't rid my mind of poor old Birdman, lying headless at the foot of the coop, caked in his own blood. Ma cupped her hand in a threatening gesture. She pursed her lips, as she does, and scowled at me. Ma ain't cruel per se, but she's no Mary Poppins either, if you catch my drift. "But, Birdman," I continued to pout. Ma rolled her eyes, then hurried outside to look for herself. When she came back in, she was furious. "Go outside and clean him up," Ma ordered. I was about to complain when she threw a long wooden spoon at me, missing me by an inch. "Do as I say, Alexander, now." I did as I was told. Ma only calls me Alexander when she's really upset. With my chin to my chest, I lumbered across our long, narrow backyard, heading toward the coop. My heart was thumping like a jackrabbit, my mouth as dry as toast. I'm not as tough as Pa, not even close. He ain't scared of nothing. Too bad he went away. A steady stream of tears was sliding down my cold, pink cheeks. The last thing I wanted to do was see Birdman like that. Poor old Birdman. I remember the day Pa brought him home. The rooster was so proud and cocky and brightly feathered. Pa even let me name him. Standing at the entrance, shovel in hand, I scooped the ravaged rooster up off the bile-coloured grass and salty wood chips. It was unsettling to say the least. Birdman's beady little eyes remained open, watching me during the entire process. I shoveled the mutilated rooster into a large, green garbage bag. Then I dragged across the crisp, coffee-coloured leaves blanketing the forest floor which runs along the edge of our property. I was crying the entire time. A thought came to mind. Whoever or whatever did this to Birdman might be watching me right now. I froze. If I were to be eaten by some creature out in the woods, who would find my body? I brushed aside my disparaging thoughts and continued to crunch along the rim of the forest, stopping at a small clearing. I buried my rooster. The ground was frigid and uncooperative, but I managed as best as I could. Afterward, I was as hungry as a bear. I ate 3 plates of pasta and still felt peckish. Burying my dead animal is hard work, let me tell you. I couldn't fall asleep that night. I wondered who or what could have done that to my beloved Birdman. There were no tracks leading to or from the coop. No sign of a break-in or tampering. Nothing. Could have been a neighbour's dog, I thought. Except the floor of the coop was raised, so tunneling wasn't an option. Plus, I couldn't imagine how a mangy mutt could have penetrated the lock. None of this made sense. Finally, after tossing and turning for hours, I slept. Then, it happened again. I woke up late the following morning. That's 2 days in a row. A miracle. As I hurried outside to feed the flock, I noticed something peculiar. At first, I hoped it was just my imagination. Then, as I inched closer toward the foul chicken coop, I stopped dead in my tracks. The animals inside the coop had been slaughtered. Each and every one. Fresh globs of blood and gore stained the surrounding mesh, turning it a deep crimson red. The entrance, however, remained locked and intact. I fell to my knees and puked. I couldn't help myself. "That's impossible," Ma bellowed when I told her. Her eyes were full of accusation. She pushed past me and ran outside, still in a nightgown, to have a look. She brought a shotgun. I ran into my bedroom and watched from the safety of my window. I didn't exactly trust that look in Ma's eyes, nor did I trust the ensemble of carcasses scattered across the coop. Ma surveilled our entire property before re-entering our cozy country home. I was ordered to dispose of the dead chickens straight away. My protests proved impotent. I cursed her as I fetched my shovel yet again, unhappy to waste this glorious Sunday morning burying birds. As I marched closer to the coop, the feeling of being watched stole over me. Cautiously, I glanced over my left shoulder, looking deep into the looming forest. Was an unknown assailant lurking in the woods, watching me, waiting for the appropriate time to attack? It was impossible. This put a jump in my step. One thing was certain. I didn't want to end up like poor old Birdman. There were 11 chickens in the flock, all dismembered. Some were decapitated, but many had been strangled. Their tiny, tortured tongues lay leaking in their broken yellow beaks. One cheek had both its legs ripped off, its plumage stained with its own blood and feces. It was gruesome. Nothing could have prepared me for such vile wretchedness. I was totally repulsed. Digging their grave was a daunting task, and not without its pitfalls, but I did it anyway. It took all day. At one point, a chicken flew off my shovel and rolled away. Could this day get any worse? I hoped not. I prayed for Pa to return home. Surely, Pa would know a more efficient way to dispose of these corpses. I mean, there must be a better way than this. I was cold and tired and miserable. Worse, I was scared half to death, and I knew Ma was too. I slept poorly all week. My mind was in overdrive. What kind of monster would harm those innocent chicks? Someone or something must have penetrated the lock on the coop. But how? More to the point, after mutilating our entire flock, they must have locked and closed the door, then split, leaving no footprints, tracks, nor evidence whatsoever behind. It was as if a ghost had murdered our flock. Slowly, things began to return to normal, as they do in real life. Ma brought home more chicks, and this time she set up an electric fence around the pen to ward off any predators. "That ought to do it," she said. I hoped she was right. This time, I refused to become friends with the animals. I didn't want to be heartbroken yet again. Except I did end up befriending our new rooster. I couldn't help myself. He was an amazing bird. I named him Alistair, but shortened it to Alice. One morning, Alice didn't wake me up. Instead, I was awakened by Ma's persistent squawking. Something was up, and it probably wasn't good. Ma was on the phone with the police. She was completely out of her mind, talking in circles, screaming bloody murder. I went outside to check things out. The coop was intact and seemingly not tampered with. The flock, however, was murdered. Blood and bone and beaks and brain galore. It was a sad sight. What did these animals do to deserve this? I was outraged. I wanted to get to the bottom of this, and fast. So I called Taylor, my BFF, for help. Taylor arrived full of spirit. To her, this was fun. She grabbed my hand and led me deep into the forest to start her investigation. She wanted to search for anything unusual. "There must be clues," she said in an excited voice. We spent all day playing in the woods. We saw a plethora of birds, a drove of squirrels, a red-bellied snake, and even a white-tailed deer. But nothing out of the ordinary. These woods are home to eastern coyotes, red foxes, and the occasional black bear, Taylor told me matter-of-factly. But those creatures only come out at night, and not even a brilliant bear, she concluded, is clever enough to infiltrate a chicken coop, not with that electric fence and all. We were stumped. Taylor joined us for a hearty dinner, during which she suggested we purchase a surveillance camera. Ma agreed. The next day, Ma went to town to stock up on chickens yet again, but this time she brought home a brand new surveillance camera, which I had the displeasure of trying to set up. By now, I was worried about Ma. She was coming unglued. When I suggested we ask Pa for help, she got mad at me, so I kept my mouth shut after that. Even the cops were baffled. Our neighbours, and I use the term loosely, seeing how our closest neighbour was a 10-minute bike ride away, were put on high alert. This was big news. Everyone in town was talking about it. Then, it happened again. Our entire flock was dismembered. Random chicken parts and bloodstained feathers were everywhere, but no tracks, nor any sign of disruption as far as I could tell. I ran inside and called Taylor, who was most intrigued. She rushed straight over after school. I stayed home that day to clean up the carnage. I spent the remainder of the afternoon alone in my room, sulking. I didn't want to bury any more birds. By now, there's an animal graveyard in my backyard, which is immensely disturbing. I've watched Pet Sematary. I know how these stories end up. I waited for Taylor to arrive before scrolling through the surveillance video. She swiped the smartphone from my hand and proceeded to scroll through the hours of footage. She stopped suddenly with a face full of scorn. "There it is." We both saw the creature. "I don't know what this thing is," she said in a faraway voice, "but whatever it is, it ain't right." We watched the same scene over and over. It occurred at 4:09 in the morning. That's when the creature first appeared on the screen. The creature was covered in thick, matted fur. It looked tall, like a bear, except it was skinny, like a human. It kind of looked like Bigfoot, without the footprints, of course. But it was impossible for us to get a proper look at it. The thing on screen was blurry, like a mirage or something. It almost seemed fake. The first thing it did, I swear to God, was look directly into the camera and wave. But not in a friendly way. More like a "I know you can see me" kind of way. Then the creature vanished, only to reappear a moment later inside the coop, where it proceeded to murder the entire flock of chickens, one by one, and it did so at an impossible speed. "Wait, hold on a second," Taylor said. We rewatched the grisly scene at half speed. She shook her head. "That's impossible." We watched, transfixed, as the creature savagely ripped and clawed and gutted our poultry. The poor chicks didn't even know what killed them. It happened so fast. The rooster was killed first. The creature reached down and bit its head clean off. Then, in a series of bone-chilling attacks, it slayed the entire flock in similar fashion. This took 6 seconds in total. Afterward, the creature made a series of peculiar gestures, as if performing some sort of ritual. Blood was dripping from its monster-like face, its teeth stained in a superlative shade of red. The creature looked again at the surveillance camera, only this time I could feel it penetrating my mind. Taylor felt it too. She screamed and ran into the bathroom and locked herself inside. I watched the remainder of the video alone in my bedroom. I wish I hadn't. I watched the creature vanish into thin air, but before doing so, a strange and sickly voice entered my head. "I'm coming for you, Alexander," it told me, using the deepest voice I'd ever heard. "Then I'm going to murder your mother and that snot-nosed girlfriend of yours." I ran downstairs to show Ma the video. When I did, there was nothing on the screen but static. "But that's impossible," I said, scratching my head. Ma looked like she wanted to rip my head off and ram it down my throat. I called for Taylor, who was still in the bathroom. She stepped out, wiped the remaining tears from her freckled face, then called home. She left soon thereafter and didn't even say goodbye. Last night, I had a terrible dream. I dreamed I was the creature in the woods, killing those poor, innocent chickens. I felt their souls being plucked from their bodies as I clenched my meaty hands around their necks. I tore them each to shreds and delighted in doing so. I dreamed it was me who snuck into the house, crept up those long, creaky stairs, and wrapped my cold, bare hands around Ma's wrinkled neck. I watched with glee as she let out a final breath, her eyes bulging from their sockets in utter torment. I dreamed it was me who appeared outside Taylor's bedroom door, watching silently as she slept. I woke up in a pool of sweaty sheets, with my dream floating through my mind like a ghost whispering in the wind. My fingernails were crusted with blood. I was dog-tired and famished. Wearily, I crawled out of bed, found my way downstairs, and ate a hearty breakfast. The house was library quiet. Ma must have slept in. This was highly unusual. I tiptoed to her bedroom door and waited. I was too scared to knock. My bloodstained hands were trembling, my legs ready to buckle and fold at any given moment. "Ma?" I said, quietly, as to not disturb her. "Ma, you alright?" No answer. I tried again. Nothing. Maybe she went into town to gather supplies. Maybe her and Pa were having coffee somewhere. That would be nice. But I knew better. The rooster hadn't crowed this morning. This was not good news. "Ma!" I called out one last time. I was afraid to peek inside a bedroom. Some places are off limits no matter what. Then I remembered the surveillance camera. Maybe I should check it just to see. I did, and what I saw will forever haunt my dreams. The creature returned again late last night. Only this time it appeared outside our back door, snarling into the surveillance camera. For a split second, I saw myself inside the creature's eyes. When I heard it speak my name, I dropped my phone and ran inside my bedroom and locked the door. I've been hiding in here ever since. I know deep down this will only prolong the inevitable, but for the moment, I'm okay with that. I know what comes next. I know I'll have to enter Ma's room sooner or later. But first, I should clean this blood from my fingernails before someone sees it. Maybe then I'll call Taylor. She'll want to come help me. Yes, that would be nice. She can help me find the creature in the woods, once and for all. When I was a little girl, I had a strange friend that I believed I'd made up, until about an hour ago. My father and mother were out of the house a lot when I was a child. It never occurred to me then that we were poor, but looking back, I realised that we must have been. Mom worked 2 jobs. serving in a restaurant and driving a bus for the school. Dad worked in a fishing market during the day so he could attend night school in the evenings. Both of them would come home very late and flop down for a few hours before they had to do it again. They were never cruel to us, they just didn't have the time for my older brother and me. Mum and Dad got together in high school, and Mum's senior class photos show the swell of her belly as she carried my brother. They were parents before they were more than children themselves, and with no real skills, they had to take whatever jobs they could get to keep food on the table. For the first 10 years of my life, there wasn't a lot of happiness. There were no Christmas mornings, there weren't a lot of birthday presents, and I lacked the parental involvement that a lot of my peers seemed to have. This was what probably led me to create Mr. Gozo. My brother was supposed to be watching me after school. I've talked about my brother a little bit, but I don't think I've told you much about him. He was 8 years older than me, a senior in high school who was supposed to be my caretaker while my parents were at work. This usually translated to him in his room with the door closed, or him leaving the house and telling me not to answer the door or go outside. This meant that I spent a lot of time alone as a child, but I much preferred the times he left me alone. My brother was more than a neglectful babysitter. He could be pretty mean and seemed to delight in tormenting me. If he was gone, then it was just me and Mr. Gozo with the house to ourselves. Mr. Gozo was a friend that I discovered living in my house one day. He was tall, taller than my dad even, and had a strange whispery voice that always used to make me laugh. He wore grown-up clothes, a long coat, and a pair of suit pants with square-toed cowboy boots sticking from underneath them. His head was round and pale. His eyes always seemed a little too big for his face, and he didn't have any ears, which I found very funny as a kid. His smile was my favourite thing about him, because it reminded me of the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Something else about him that always reminded me of that cat was that he would disappear whenever anyone else was around. One minute we would be having a tea party or playing hide and seek, and the next my brother would come home and he would just vanish. I told my parents about Mr. Gozo, but they only smiled and said it was good that I had such an active imagination. My brother just said I was a little freak and to stay out of his way. Mr. Gozo did not like my brother. "He is a brute and he knows nothing of imagination," he said in that buzzy, cultured sort of voice he had. Gozo and I played a lot, but I remember his favourite game was hide and seek. He could never beat me though. I was an excellent hider, and he would clump around for a while before finally saying I'd won, and I would burst out and wrap my arms around his leg. Despite never winning, he always seemed to want to play. He seemed to like chasing me through the house, and when I think back on those days now, I see how lucky I was to never learn anything to the contrary. You see, Mr. Gozo would always make these bets before we started playing hide and seek. He would promise me things. "If I can't find you, then I will make you whatever you want to eat," or "If you win, you can watch whatever you want on TV, no matter what it is," or something like that. But then he would always follow it up by saying, "But if I win, you have to come back to my house to play." I would always agree. I was 10 and very good at hiding. When I say he never found me, I mean he never found me. I would hide under things that were too hard for him to lift or hide in places he was too tall to climb into. I would camouflage myself with blankets and pillows, and I could remain absolutely still for quite some time. Mr. Gozo would try his hardest, stomping around while his two big eyes roving everywhere. Eventually, he would just give up and tell me I'd won. He always made good on his promises too. I'd watch Sailor Moon or Powerpuff Girls in the middle of the night, long after Cartoon Network stopped showing cartoons, and I've eaten chocolate ice cream and pizza when we barely had groceries in the house. Much like Mr. Gozo though, if my brother came home early, he couldn't see the food or the show or the new toy Mr. Gozo had given me. I would turn back to find an empty plate or a staticky TV, and Mr. Gozo nowhere to be found. Mr. Gozo would play anything I wanted, but he asked to play hide and seek at least once a day. If I said I didn't want to, he never pushed the issue. He also never let losing deter him from playing. It appeared that whatever he wanted to do with me at his house could wait. He was a perfect companion for a lonely child. I never saw his more sinister side until I looked back after the incident. Not until hide and seek, when I lost my brother. It was late, probably after 11 o'clock, and Mr. Gozo and I were playing hide and seek as we had been for most of the day. I kept stumping him even after hours of playing, but this looked like the time he might finally win. I was hiding beneath the couch cushions, compressing myself into a divot under the middle cushion where the springs were sagging. I could see him searching from under a small gap in the cushion, and Mr. Gozo was looking desperately for me. He had lost 8 times in a row, and I saw that his patience was starting to deteriorate. He was pushing things aside, rustling the curtains, and pushing the pillows off the couch roughly as he searched for me. As the pillows hit the floor, I must have moved slightly, because he turned those much too expressive eyes back to the couch. They zeroed in on the cushion, and I knew that Gozo was about to win one. He wrapped his long, sinuous fingers around it, grinning as he prepared to lift it up, and I tried to stifle a laugh as I prepared to be found. Just then, keys rattled in the door, and I saw Mr. Gozo turn his head to look. I looked too, and when I turned back, Mr. Gozo had disappeared. My brother walked into the living room then, and as I climbed out from under the couch, I could smell him before I saw him. He'd come home like this a few times, smelling sour and like the chemicals Mum kept under the sink, and he sighed in disgust as he looked at the house. I hadn't expected he would be back so soon, and Mr. Gozo had been a little rough in his searching the last few times. There were pillows and blankets on the ground, the curtains were open, books were scattered around the shelf, and the magazines were on the floor. The living room was messy, and as I climbed from the couch, he asked me what the hell I'd done. "Nothing," I said timidly. "Mr. Gozo and I were playing hide and seek." My brother rolled his eyes. "Mr. Gozo, Mr. Gozo, Mr. Gozo." He slurred the name as he said it, stumbling a little as he flopped onto the couch. "I'm so sick of hearing about that stupid freak. Clean up this crap before Mom and Dad get home and yell at me for it." I started picking up, feeling him watch me as I moved around. He was acting weird, weirder than usual, and he was making me uncomfortable as he sat staring on the couch. I cleaned up the books, the magazines, and put the blankets back on the quilt rack and closed the curtains. As I went to put the pillows on the couch, I looked into his eyes and saw something I hadn't seen there before. It wasn't love. I knew what it looked like, but it was different from anything else I'd ever seen. I didn't like it, and when he caught my wrist and pulled me towards him, I squirmed and tried to get away. "Let go," I said, trying to keep the whine out of my voice. If I whined, it would only egg him on. "Don't be such a party pooper." I could smell the pungent brew. "Come sit with your big brother." I struggled, pulling against him. He was acting weird, and my brain screamed at me that I did not want him to get his hands on me. I looked around, looking for Mr. Gozo for help, and I saw him peeking from the hallway. His expressive face told me that he wanted to help, but that he didn't know how. There seemed to be a sort of duality about him, a want to help his friend, but a knowledge that such a thing would be unwise. My brother swore at me, yanking on my arm. "Just like the girl at the party," he mumbled, yanking hard and almost pulling me off my feet. Suddenly, though, I knew how to get him to stop. There was a way that Gozo could help. "I can't play with you right now. I'm playing with Mr. Gozo, and he'll get mad if we don't finish our game." I saw him sneer, but I could see something else there too. My brother pretended he wasn't a little weirded out by Mr. Gozo, but I could tell that the idea of an invisible friend kind of freaked him out. He'd seen the pictures I drew of him, and I couldn't help but notice the shudder they elicited in him sometimes. When he was wobbly like he was tonight, he was especially nervous about Mr. Gozo, and I decided to take advantage of that to get away. His grip tightened though, and he told me that, "You've played with him long enough. Why don't you play with me?" I shook my head. "Mr. Gozo will get mad. I have to finish my game." I turned back to look at the hallway and saw him shaking his head, begging me not to go on. But I pressed my luck. But if you played with us and finished the game, then I'd be done, and we could play, I guess? I tried to stay calm, but he made me nervous, his sweaty hands making my skin crawl. My brother looked thoughtful for a moment and let my arm slip out of his hand. Okay, one more game with Mr. Gozo, right? His smile made me want to run into the night and never come back. Right. You hide, and I'll hide, and Mr. Gozo counts. Go hide so he doesn't find you. My brother got up, wobbling a bit, and went down the hall to hide. I turned to go hide too, and that's when I heard Mr. Gozo's voice. Please don't do this. You could just come with me. He can't hurt you where we are going. I turned around and saw Mr. Gozo towering over me, his eyes looking sorrowful and his mouth held in a frown. Count to 100, Mr. Gozo. If you find me first, I'll go with you, but if you find him first, he has to go with you. We just looked at each other for a count of 10 before he put his hands over his eyes, and I went off to hide. I went into the kitchen, having a perfect place in mind, as I heard Gozo's count reach 15. I opened the cabinet beneath the sink and squeezed in, not sure I'd still fit. I'd found this spot once, seeing the smaller space beside it once you hide under the sink, and marked it for future use. I knew it would be too small for Mr. Gozo or my brother to squeeze into, and they would have a hard time seeing me in the little space between the drawers and wall. I squeezed in there, pulling the drawers back as I inadvertently nudged them and pressed myself as flat as I could against the wall. Even if my brother got bored and came to find me, he'd never find me here. I breathed very shallowly and stifled my gasps as I heard Gozo's count reach 100. Then, the game began. It started out normally, Gozo seeking and me hiding. He checked beneath things, he checked under things, but the gravity of the game began to shift very quickly. Gone was the playful task as he tried to find me. Gone was the careful way he looked. Now he was shoving things over and pushing them around, and it sounded like he was tearing the house apart. He moved into the kitchen, glasses breaking and things on the counter being pushed into the floor. This wasn't like him. Why was he acting like this? I shivered in my hiding place, waiting to be found, or for him to move on. I heard the table flip over, the face of the microwave shatter as it hit the ground, and the floor groan as the refrigerator was pulled over, its guts spilling everywhere. Mr. Gozo called my name, his normally happy voice cracking with sorrow and anger. I wanted to go to him then, wanted to wrap my arms around him and comfort my friend, but I didn't dare leave my cubby. I would stay hidden all night if I needed to. A part of me now feared Gozo as much as I feared my brother. Come out, he bellowed. Come out, it's not too late, you can still... What the hell is going on in here? I heard my brother yelling. I could almost picture him in the doorway to the kitchen, and as I eased out of the cubby and moved a shaking hand towards the door to the cabinet, I heard Gozo's heavy boots as they stepped towards him. My brother asking who he was and what the hell he was doing in our house. He was slurring and shouting. Gozo was silent as a grave as he walked towards him. I pushed the corner of the cabinet open just a little bit, looking out the crack and seeing two long legs as they walked towards my suddenly scared brother. I wasn't looking between his ankles as he walked. He had been so close to my hiding spot that he might have heard the silverware shivering in the drawers if I'd started shaking any harder. My name is Mr. Gozo, and I believe that you have been found. My brother screamed as Mr. Gozo blocked him from sight, and I pulled myself back into the cubby and sat shuddering as he went right on, yelling in terror. I stayed there until my parents came home an hour later and called the police. They had many questions, the police and my parents. I told them that I had been playing with Mr. Gozo when my brother came home. He was acting weird, so I said he should play hide and seek with us so I could hide from him. He was trying to get me to do things that made me feel weird, so I hid, and then Mr. Gozo had wrecked the house looking for me. When my brother came to see what all the noise was about, Mr. Gozo had taken him away, and I had hidden in my spot while he screamed. The police clearly didn't understand what I was talking about with all the Mr. Gozo stuff, but they just shook my heads when he asked my parents if they had a son. No, she's always been an only child. I could have sworn we called a sitter for her since we would be home late. Didn't you hire a sitter? Dad asked Mom. Mom just shook her head. I thought you had. They both, however, had this dreamy look in their face, confusion mixed with embarrassment, like when you walk into a room and forget what you came in for. It probably seemed weird to you that I kept calling my brother by his title and not his name. It's because, as I saw my parents looking so confused, I realized I didn't know his name either. I remembered that I had a brother, in that vague way that you remember when you were 6, you had a pet, but not precisely what happened to it. I couldn't remember his name. He was gone from all our family photos. His name was gone from any journal entry or class assignment I wrote it on, and no one remembers him at all. It was as though he never existed, and even now, I can't remember what he looked like, or what his voice sounded like. I only remembered that he existed, and now he was gone. I often wonder if that's what would have happened to me if Mr. Gozo had caught me. The police had a lot of questions after that, and it was finally agreed upon that I'd been the victim of a break-in and hidden from the intruders. They hadn't found me, so they had left after a while, and I was extremely lucky. The police agreed to check the house but found nothing. My parents said they would check the valuables, but never reported anything missing. Mr. Gozo had only taken one thing, but they couldn't remember that it existed. They sent me to bed, telling me to get some sleep while they cleared up the mess. And that's when I saw Mr. Gozo for the last time. I was lying in bed that night, listening to my parents talk about how they needed to be more careful about leaving someone here with me, when I suddenly felt his eyes on me. I rolled over to see his sad face, his heavy eyes full of sorrow, and his too big mouth turned down in a frown. I also saw the speckles of blood on his normally clean coat, and the small, hesitant smile lying just below the surface as he gauged my reaction to him. "Go away, Mr. Gozo," I said quietly. "I don't want to play with you anymore." "I made him go away. I made him stop hurting you. I showed you what I was so that you could be safe. And now you want me gone," he whispered. I rolled over, looking at him and yelling, "Go away, Gozo." "Say it again then. Say it thrice, and I'll never darken your door again." "Go away, Mr. Gozo," I almost whispered, hearing my parents stop talking downstairs. He evaporated like a fine mist, and I never saw him again. I'm grown up now, married with a girl of my own, and I hadn't thought about Mr. Gozo until a few hours ago. I was putting away laundry when I found my 4-year-old hiding in a towel closet. Emily apparently got her father's hiding genes, I suppose, because a blind man could have found her hiding under that pile of towels. She squealed as I found her, but then looked grumpy and told me to close the door before he found her. "Who?" I asked, smiling as I lifted her into my arms. "Mr. Gozo," Emily said, and my blood ran cold. She took me to a room when I asked who that was and showed me pictures. He was wearing the same long coat and straight black pants, and she even drew the square-toed boots that stick out from beneath them. She captured his face in a way that I never could as a child. His pale, oval face, his almost cartoonishly large eyes, his smiling mouth and pointy teeth, and his distinct lack of ears. His head is still shaven, but she's drawn him with a large top hat, an eye floating in the middle. The eye is blue. Were my brother's eyes maybe blue? She's in my room with me right now, whining because she can't finish a game with Mr. Gozo. Sometimes I feel like I can see him out of the corner of my eye as I write this, his smile wide and predatory. I don't know what to do. I can see Emily talking to him in the mirror, his two large forms sitting on the bed as he listens to her. Every now and again, though, I see those two big eyes as they glance over at me, knowing me and seeing me for who I am. I want to take my daughter and run, but I don't know how he will react to such a move. Perhaps I can offer him one last game, Perhaps I can give him what he always wanted. Perhaps I can save my daughter, as my big brother inadvertently saved me all those years ago. I have to try, don't I? My wife always told me to not leave the front door of our apartment unlocked. I was constantly forgetting. After what happened last night, I'll never forget again. I might never sleep again either. When I was growing up, my family lived in a small town where most people didn't even bother locking the doors most of the time. They'd pull up to the grocery store and leave their car running outside, or kids would leave their bikes out in front of their houses on the lawn with no lock or chain. I guess I kept that naive faith in humanity into my adult years and redoubled it when I moved out of the city and back to a quiet town again with my wife around 5 years ago. Recently, I left my car windows rolled down overnight and nobody stole anything from the Mazda out in the building's parking lot. I woke up the next morning to find the car untouched. It actually surprised me, but it also made me feel a little bit justified in my belief in people's general goodness. I'd had my car broken into before. I knew others who had as well, but not in the neighborhood where I lived. That sort of thing didn't happen in my neck of the woods, not anymore. The place where I live now is that rare sort of small town where bad things don't usually happen. That quiet, idyllic sort of village where there's still a main street lined with shops owned by locals, no Walmarts or power centers for miles. The occasional arson, mugging or burglary might rarely occur. Once in a blue moon, you'd hear about something bad that happened nearby. But those awful things could happen anywhere. You just never think it will happen to you until it does. My wife was more pragmatic though. She listened to a lot of true crime podcasts. "You did it again," she yelled at me last week, after I had left the door unlocked for a few hours and she noticed. "Someone's going to come in here and murder us one of these days." That was our running joke. If I left the front door open when she came home from work, half of the time I unlocked it intentionally, knowing she was coming home. She would come in the door and yell out jokingly, "I'm gonna murder you," in a playful attempt to scare me. It never worked, except maybe that one time. But she was also serious about it sometimes. When I left the door unlocked overnight once, she got really upset about it and told me never to do that again. Who knew what sort of maniac could have come in, she said. Turned out she listened to a particularly horrifying true crime story on a podcast the day prior. It was a recounting of a murderer who had done just that, entering women's houses while they slept and doing unspeakable things. I apologized, feeling bad that she was actually scared of these things. I sure wasn't, but then again, I'm a 6.5-foot tall galoot who most people don't mess with just after taking one look at me, whereas she's a 5-foot no-inch lady, so I can understand there's a difference. It wasn't like I was intentionally leaving it unlocked, I just kept forgetting. Maybe my hands were full coming in with groceries and I just never got around to it after settling things down. Or maybe it was just absent-minded distractibility on my part. Either way, I was admittedly not very good at locking the front door, especially when we were home. And then, last night happened. I went out for a late-night McDonald's run and came in with my hands full. Christine was fast asleep in the bedroom, and I sneakily unwrapped my McDouble and the straw wrapper for my chocolate milkshake. I indulged in the midnight snack. I forgot all about going to lock the front door after coming inside. Normally, the door downstairs at the main entrance of the building would serve as a secondary line of defense to the unknown dangers of the outside world. But somebody had been leaving it propped open lately, and they had done so again last night. A screwdriver had been wedged between the doorframe and the door, keeping it from closing and allowing a cold breeze in. The late night wind was chilly, but I decided to leave it, worried I would leave some poor kid who lost his keys locked out in the cold. I went to bed a couple of hours later at around 2 a.m. It didn't occur to me that I'd forgotten to lock the door of our apartment again as I walked to the bedroom in my bare feet, turning off lights as I went. After a couple of hours of restless sleep, maybe around 3:30 or 4 a.m, I got up to go to the bathroom. The apartment was completely blacked out with darkness, and I couldn't see anything except the very faint light of the moon outside. Still, I knew the apartment well enough to make it to the toilet by feeling the walls and doorways with my hand. I groped my way from handhold to handhold, stumbling my way through the blackness into the bathroom. The faint chirp of crickets could be heard outside. I knew it would still be a couple of hours at least until sunrise. I still had time to get a bit more sleep before getting up for work. There was a creaking sound from the living room suddenly, as if someone had just stepped on the floorboard. A shiver went down my spine as I stood there in front of the mirror in the bathroom, about to return to bed. It was probably just a neighbour, I thought to myself. The floors and walls in the building were so thin you could hear everything that happened next door and in the apartment above. And our upstairs neighbours were always so loud, it didn't seem abnormal. But still, it sounded slightly different, as if it were closer, setting me slightly on edge. Regardless, I went back into the bedroom. My heart was beating fast in my chest as I laid down in the bed and had a bit of difficulty closing my eyes. I thought about the door outside and the door to our apartment, realizing I'd perhaps left it unlocked. I thought about the squeak of the floorboards, but couldn't help but wonder if I was right about what had made that sound. My cat suddenly jumped up on my lap from the floor, burrowing into my arms as if hiding from the cold, or from something else. She wasn't purring like she normally would have been, looking for affection. She seemed to be looking for something else. Protection, maybe? Then suddenly, she looked up sharply with her mirrored eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. I followed her gaze as she froze and stared at the space ahead of us. As I lay there, looking at the doorway to the room with her, I couldn't help but feel like there was the vague shape of a person there, and I thought I saw eyes vaguely hovering 6 feet from the ground. Eyes like my cat's, mirrored and reflecting the dim moonlight back at me. Someone looking at us from the doorway to the bedroom? Or just my imagination? My cat buried her head deeper into my armpit, and I looked up again, and the shape in the doorway seemed to be gone, if it had been there to begin with. I shook it off as ridiculous, telling myself the same old thing. We lived in a quiet apartment in a quiet town. Things like that don't happen to us here. What I was worried about, that was something from a movie or TV show, not something from real life. Reluctantly, after a long while of listening and glancing distrustfully at the darkness, I hesitantly closed my eyes. And I drifted back into a fitful and uneasy sleep, the cat sitting tense in the crook of my arm, watchful. In my dreams, I knew I was asleep, and yet I could control nothing. There was the soft sound of footsteps approaching from the darkness, of the door squeaking on its hinges as it opened, and I felt someone's presence enter the room. They stood over the bed and watched us. I was laying in bed with my arms limp at my sides. My wife was sleeping next to me, and I could feel the dark presence standing over us, watching us, breathing heavily. The man, which wasn't a man or a shadow, but something else perhaps in between, stood staring at me from the darkness. It stood over me and murmured something incomprehensible, an incantation or a prayer perhaps. It refused to leave, its face boring into mine with its rotten breath reeking like spoiled meat. I thought it would never leave, when suddenly it was moving on and inspecting my wife instead, probing her with its glassy reflective eyes. I was paralyzed with fear and tried to move my arm to wake her, but was unable. Everything I did felt like it was in quicksand, my movements heavy and clumsy, weighted with impossible forces holding me down. I tried to scream, but found my vocal cords were likewise frozen, the same as the rest of me. The shadowy creature stood, hovering over my wife for a few long moments, appraising her, then left the bedroom with an unsatisfied air. I woke up the next morning to the sound of a scream. My wife couldn't speak to me when I asked her what was wrong. She was clutching her arms tightly around herself, trembling, and just pointed at the front door with a shaking hand. It was unlocked, and there was blood all over the doorknob. Not only that, but it was in our kitchen, I noticed as well. Boot prints covered in red were running all through the apartment where it'd been. Not only that, but there was a note on our coffee table. The police have it now, but I'll try to sum up its contents for you here. Thank you for letting me into your home last night. Really helped myself to the contents of your fridge. The leftover roast was excellent, rare, just the way I like it. However, you and your wife were not quite to my taste. I prefer blondes and redheads, brunettes in a pinch. but the two of you have such dark hair. It is so unfortunate. Did you see me there last night, looking at you from the doorway of your bedroom? I thought I caught you staring perhaps, as I watched with my night vision goggles. Sometimes they catch the light of the moon just so, and people see a reflection, like a large cat is watching them from the shadows. But I'm so careful now. I don't think you saw me. If you did, you wouldn't have gone back to sleep. Did you feel me standing over you, watching you while you dreamt? Did you feel me in your dreams as I debated slicing pieces from you? I almost did, you know, but decided against it. If not for the leftover prime rib, I might have. But I was no longer all that hungry. Still, I feel a craving for something else. I'll see what other doorknobs twist and turn in this building. Wish me luck. Jaguar. P.S. You both look so peaceful while you're sleeping. After reading that, I panicked immediately. There were photos of us tucked beneath the letter, pictures he had taken of us while we were asleep, eyes closed and snoring. I found out a few hours later that 2 women in our building were dead, both blondes who lived on the 4th floor together. We'd seen them in the elevator, but I didn't know their names until finding out they were dead. 2 more victims of unlocked doors. Victims of the Jaguar. The police are out searching for him. Who knows if they'll ever find him though. I hope they do. He took a set of our house keys with him. And I can't help but wonder if maybe one day he's coming back. For dinner late last night, I had a bowl of fresh from the box mac and cheese, a supermarket bag salad, 20% off, and an off-brand light beer. I enjoyed this gourmet feast on a tray in front of the TV because Terminator 2 was on. I tell you this so that you will understand that I am not, in any sense, a part of the high-end food world. My fiancée, on the other hand, was. Rosalie, self-identified as a foodie, and slept with a copy of Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat on a nightstand. She was constantly scouring local markets for the freshest ingredients and newest combinations. She didn't mind ingredients lists a mile long or dishes that took time to make. Cooking was her zen, and the kitchen was a temple. That meant, of course, that we also had to make holy pilgrimages to the hottest restaurants. I didn't share Rosalie's passion for food, but we shared just about everything else. Different as we were both willing to learn and grow together. I've never had that with anyone else, and I wonder if I ever will again. You see, my fiancée, Rosalie, died a few months ago. I was a mess for a few weeks after. I soon realized I needed to say goodbye to Rosalie in a way that a closed casket and a few hollow words hadn't provided. I decided to try an experience that had been Rosalie's last obsession: eating at a dark restaurant. If you don't know, the concept of a dark restaurant is that by depriving the diner of their sight, they are able to focus more fully on their sense of taste. Some say it's gimmicky, some say it's science. I just thought it might be the best way to find some closure and move on with my life. The only dark restaurants I could find were hundreds of miles from the mid-sized city where I lived. Not only that, but a lot of them looked incredibly expensive and pretentious as well. If there's one thing I learned visiting taco trucks with Rosalie, it was that price was no guarantee of quality. Not only that, but often the restaurants that focus the most on appearances cut corners in other areas, like treatment of the staff, for instance. And stressed, underpaid workers often cut corners themselves just to get through the day. Rosalie used to say the same places was so toxic you could feel it as soon as you walked in the door. Taking care of Rosalie's old belongings was hard. I sorted through her stuff a little at a time, partly to lose myself in the memories, partly because I didn't have the stomach for much more. I knew that once I'd sealed up that last cardboard box, she'd really, truly be gone. I was going through her nightstand drawers when I found it. An ad for a mobile dark restaurant called the Lights Out experience. Based on its tour dates, the Lights Out experience will be coming through town in just a few days. I scrambled to call the number on the leaflet and make a reservation. An automated voice walked me through the steps as I used my phone's keypad to punch in the date and time I wanted to visit Lights Out. It was annoying, but as something of an introvert, I think I actually prefer a machine rather than a person. I scrambled to find a pen when the automated voice read off the address where my Lights Out experience would be. I had to press 1 to repeat the message several times before I was sure I'd gotten it right. It was strange that Lights Out didn't have an email service, website, or even Yelp. They didn't have an Instagram either, but then again, what would they post? Little black photos of complete darkness? My suspicions deepened when I saw the address, an empty factory in a mostly abandoned industrial part of town. I wondered if it was all a scam. If it was, at least they didn't have any of my important information. I figured I'd go anyway. If it was all a practical joke, fine, lesson learned. At least I'd have a chance to get dressed up and drive to an evening meal with a window down, listening to some chill beats, the way we used to do it. There's something so gloomy about that whole side of town. The dead grass in the fenced-off lots, the rusted corrugated metal, the potholed streets. I was starting to be glad I'd be eating in the dark instead of having the view of the place. But when I pulled up to the address of Lights Out, my jaw dropped. They'd literally rolled out a red carpet for guests, lined with brass poles and velvet ropes. Glittering lamps strung overhead illuminated our path in the gathering dusk. There was an ornate facade in front of the old factory door that reminded me of what the circus uses for funhouses and arcades. The big, flowing letters pronounced, "The Lights Out Experience." So far, the only dark about the whole thing was the doorway, which was as black as a toothless open mouth. I'm not sure why that was the image that came to mind, but I shivered a little as I walked toward it. I calmed down a bit when I saw that I wasn't the only customer arriving. Cars that cost more than I'd make in my life and shining black limousines discharged men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns onto the sumptuous red carpet. A few cars diverted to a hidden, garage-like structure that I figured was for clients even more VIP than the crowd unloading in front of me. I suddenly realized that at no point had I seen a price for Lights Out. At worst, I'd just have to order the cheapest thing on the menu and hope they took MasterCard. My fellow diners didn't enter Lights Out en masse. They formed an orderly line outside before stepping, one group at a time, into the darkness. The facade looked a whole lot different up close. What had looked like a quaint painting of happy Victorian banqueteers now seemed fantastic, even sinister. A ghostly woman catching her tears in a wine glass that shone with a silver glow. A man wearing a skull face paint and a top hat feasting on a plateful of human eyes. A hooded figure grabbing a faraway appetizer with abnormally long, gnarled arms. Even more strangely, every figure that wasn't monstrous was blindfolded. If anyone tried to cover my eyes with something, I decided I'd be out of there. Goodbyes be damned. When it was my turn to cross the threshold, I hesitated. The air in there was much colder, and the cross breeze seemed to be pulling me in. People behind me started murmuring, clearing throats, and other polite signals for me to move. In the end, my fear of social interaction overcame my fear of the unknown, and I stepped into Lights Out. I think I actually held my breath. "Welcome to Lights Out," a suave female voice exclaimed. "Name and reservation, please." I provided what I was asked for. How they checked anything in the absolute pitch black around us, I had no idea. I heard clacking high heels approach me. "Hold out your hand, please," the voice requested. I felt like a fool, but I did as I was told. I held in a gasp when the anonymous voice placed one end of a silk rope in my palm. It was true. The absence of sight and sound heightened my other senses. I felt every fibre of the cord, and the unexpectedness of it all sent a delicious tingle running up my spine. "Now, if you'll kindly hold onto the cord and watch your step," the voice added, "I'll guide you to your table." The first thing I noticed was how vast the space was. Everything in the old factory must have been gutted. It felt like standing in a massive cave chamber, unable to know where the wall and ceiling might be. "You definitely seem to know your way around in the dark," I commented. The quiet, only broken by the rustling of other guests and my guide's shoes on the bare concrete, was a little unnerving. "The tables are in a grid pattern, always the same distance apart, so it's actually quite easy," my guide responded. "And besides, I was born blind, so you could say I'm used to it." "I'm sorry, Not to worry, sir. Here we are." I felt a sensual tug of the rope guide me into a plush chair. "Simply hold your hands out to find your dining set. If you need to summon our staff, simply ring the bell in front of you." "And, I ventured. How do I order?" "We offer a set menu, sir, so that won't be necessary. Enjoy your meal." The high heels faded into the distance. I suddenly felt very alone. I couldn't see my hands in front of my face, but I soon ran them over the linen tablecloths, napkins and silverware, a wine glass, a water cup. To kill time, I tried to focus on the sounds of the other diners and imagine what they might look like. The person to my right must have been really glutton, because they were snuffling, snorting, and chomping just like a pig. It sounded like they had a whole deer carcass over there, an enormous quantity of food. Meanwhile, the people on my left were like robots. Their cups and silverware clinked so mechanically, I felt like I could set my watch by it, if I could see my watch, that is. For some reason, I imagined them as the Grim Reaper and his family of little Grim Reapers, all out for a Sunday dinner. It was a fight to hold back my laughter. Rosalie would have loved this. I heard the sound of pouring in plates being placed in front of me, followed by the tinkling of a tiny bell. "Your first course, sir." The voice was male, so oily and soft and so close to my ear that I jumped a little. I was never going to get used to this. Not sure what else to do, I reached out with my fork. The first course felt like some sort of bread dish. I cut off a bit and tried it. It melted in my mouth, and I think I actually sighed out loud. French toast with a custard and tropical fruits. It was heavenly. More than that, it was the last dish Rosalie talked about making before the accident. What a perfect coincidence. Maybe somehow, here, in this bizarre place surrounded by strangers in the dark, I can actually make peace with Rosalie's memory. I was reaching for another forkful of French toast when I felt a hand grasp my wrist. I nearly shrieked and tried to recoil, but those delicate fingers held fast. The touch felt familiar somehow, but very, very cold. "Come on," Rosalie whispered. "Aren't you going to save me a bite?" It couldn't be. But whoever it was, the person across from me sounded exactly like my dead fiancé. I swallowed. My throat was dry. I polished all of the water in a single go, then reached for the wine. It was a fruity, flavorful Spanish wine called Grula del Paso, which I only knew about because Rosalie always had it in the house. It was a favorite. What the hell was going on? I think you're at the wrong table. Sorry about that," I stammered. "Don't be silly," the voice like Rosalie snorted. "There's no other place I'd rather be." "Is this some kind of a joke?" I hissed, starting to get really angry now. "Because if it isn't funny. I mean, the French toast isn't that bad, but I think it needs more cinnamon, don't you?" the voice like Rosalie asked. "You can never add too much cinnamon." "Well, I mean, unless you drop the spice jar into the cake," I grinned in spite of myself. It was an inside joke Rosalie and I had. When she was making my mother's 60th birthday cake, the cinnamon container fell into the batter. She baked the cake without noticing, and my mother was treated to an odd, lumpy glass object on a birthday cake. If this person had anything to do with my Rosalie, they'd know that story. They'd react. "That could have happened to anyone." My arm received a playful smack. "And if she keeps bugging me about my short hair, next time will be a cayenne pepper." It was impossible. We were talking as if no time at all had passed, as if it had never happened. if this was some kind of horrible prank. Fine, I was going to believe for as long as I could. I licked every bit of cream and fruit from my fork as we discussed everything from the vacations we never got to take to our high school experiences. Even those questions that you never think to ask your partner until it's too late. Like, what was your favourite memory we had together? A tiny bell rang. Second course, the oily male voice announced. I gotta go now, babe, Rosalie sighed. I'll see you in time. What? I gasped. Wait, no. I reached out wildly, but found only empty darkness. Hey, Rosalie, hey! I stood blindly and started to wander away from the table, until I noticed the heavy silence. Even in the dark, I could feel the eyes watching me. It felt like there were hundreds of them. Have a seat, please, sir. When I tried to protest, gnarly fingers as long as my arms pushed me back into a seated position, nails dug into my skin. And please, enjoy the second course. A rich, charred odour sizzled up from the plate in front of me, mixed with caramelised onions and the sour tang of beer. This time, I didn't even need to take a bite to recognise the meal. They say smell and scent has the closest ties to memory, and I remember this smell very well indeed. October 1990s. I was 5 or 6 years old on a camping trip with my father. It took us forever to set up the ancient, complicated tarp tent and get a fire going, and my stomach was rumbling by the time the steaks came out of the cooler. Dad cooked them right on the fire and made a sauce from the meat drippings, onion, black pepper, mustard, and a splash of beer. Unbeknownst to me, Dad had also buried some potatoes with garlic wrapped in tinfoil under the fire as a side. I burned my tongue on everything, and it was glorious. It was also the last time my father cooked for me. The heart attack came a few days later, and it was all downhill from there. I was too young to understand or remember most of it, but that last camping trip together still stands out in my mind. There might be some ashes in the potatoes, my father's voice said from across the table, but they should taste okay anyway. How is this happening? I whispered, flailing blindly again and feeling nothing. Well, you just wrap the potatoes in foil and bury them around the fire. It's not that complicated. Are you okay, kiddo? No, I sobbed. No, I definitely am not. Dad listened for a solid 20 minutes while I explained everything that had gone wrong in my life. How lonely I'd been in high school, how I never really took advantage of my time in college, my regrets about choosing nursing as a career, how hard it was just to make ends meet, how bleak the future seemed, Rosalie's accident. He was a good listener. He made a comment here or there, but mostly just gave me room to vent. When the words ran out, I dug into my steak and potatoes with gusto, wondering about the presents that waited patiently in the dark on the other side of the table. The bell sounded. This time, I didn't even get a chance to say goodbye. Be good, kiddo. You turned out alright. With that, my father, or whoever was across from me, stepped back into the absolute blackness and was gone. Dessert is served. My spoon touched the rim of an elegant glass dish. I wondered who my dining partner would be this time. After all, I wasn't close to anyone else who died. I could tell other diners were having conversations, but they were always just a bit too faint to understand. Some definitely weren't in English, and others were sounds that I'm not sure you could call a language at all. I didn't want to speculate about what some of them might be eating or discussing, and I had a feeling that if I could hear what was going on around me, I'd be too terrified to move. Hurry up, man, a slurred SoCal voice said from across the table, or the ice cream's gonna melt. I was stumped. I had no idea who this person could be. Something about the tone felt vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I dug into the ice cream to gain some time. It was typical, cheap chocolate soft serve that you could get for 99 cents at a gas station within walking distance of my old university. University, that was it. My freshman year, I had a roommate from Southern California. We took a couple of night walks to a gas station for a 1 a.m. snack. Todd Wurlitzer? I ventured. The very same, man. I could tell the figure on the other side of the table was excited that I'd remembered. What are you doing here? I didn't mean to be rude, but I was dumbfounded and a little disappointed that an ex-roommate who I barely remembered was about to be my last interaction here in the otherworldly darkness of the lights-out experience. I had so many more things I wanted to ask Rosalie, so many stories I wanted to hear from my dad just one more time. Hey, yeah. I could almost imagine Todd scratching his neck awkwardly like he used to. It's kinda complicated, man. The more Todd stalled, the more I felt my anger building. Now I remembered what Todd was like. The guy never took responsibility for anything. Not for cleaning the room, not for his schoolwork, not even for his own life. He'd been such a downer, and here I was, stuck with him again. What? I groaned. I guess I just wanted to say thanks, Todd sighed. Everybody always bailed on me, man, ever since I was a little kid. Dad bailed for a job in Seattle. Mom stayed but got lost in the bottle, which is just another way to bail, I guess. The only friends I had in Cali were only my friends until somebody better came along. You were the only one who ever invited me someplace, and meant it. I blinked. This definitely wasn't what I'd expected. Todd went on. Look, I get that we only hung out a few times, but you were always real with me. I dropped out later, but you gave me this idea. This idea that you could go for a night walk with a stranger, and they might really talk to you, and they might even listen if you talk to them, and then you both could just chill and have an ice cream and just look at the moon or whatever. It was, my pleasure. I didn't know what to say, but now that I thought about it, I actually had kind of enjoyed those rambling, aimless walks with Todd too. It gave me hope, kept me living, for a while at least. Well, I guess about 4 years and 11 months to be exact. But anyway, they were a good 4 years. I came out of my shell, parted with some wild people, started drawing. Hey, I actually became a big name in the graphic world back out west. Pretty cool, huh? You might have worn one of my t-shirt designs without realizing it. Isn't that trippy? Yeah. I couldn't help but smile. Pretty trippy, man. Hey, look, I gotta bounce, but stay real, okay? I'll try, Todd. I was already imagining the peace sign he was probably throwing me, despite the darkness. And it was, good to see you again. Good to see you too, man. What was left of the ice cream melted. I jumped a little when I felt a silk cord slide into my hand. If you'll please come with me, sir, we need to get your check and prepare this table for the next customer. It was the blind woman from earlier. Why hadn't I heard the clacking of her heels? Had I been that lost in thought? Following her to the exit, a subtle change had taken place. Despite the strangeness of absolute darkness, the dining sounds and conversations around us now seemed normal. No eldritch abominations gnawing on forgotten bones. No more vampires sucking their dinner dry. No more conversations with ghosts, demons, or the dead. It was a normal restaurant, lost in total obscurity. Once back by the well-lit front desk, I began to wonder if sensory deprivation had made me hallucinate the whole thing. Then I got a look at the bill. It was printed in the same gimmicky circus font as the facade outside, but instead of a price, I just saw a large, fancy number 3. What's this? I held at the paper, confused. That's the number of appearances you owe us. Diners who you will entertain here at lights out as a payment for your own experience. Some will be others who you want to talk to. Others will be those who will want to talk to you. The receptionist smiled. And I'd suggest you put your affairs in order, sir. According to our records, your first experience is due to be next Tuesday.